Back in 2020, Garmin released the GTN 650 Xi. It's basically just a more refined version of the GTN 650 with some added safety features. With these added features comes a little bit of added complexity though, so let's dive in on this full tutorial on how to use the Garmin GTN 650 Xi. So you can see that I have the GTN 650 Xi pulled up on my iPad mini. This is using the Garmin GTN Xi Trainer app, which I highly recommend. It's a great pilot resource, and if you want to follow along with me throughout this video, go for it. You can see the first screen that we have pulled up is the database screen. So this shows that my databases are expired. However, with this being a sim, I'm not as worried about it. If your databases are expired in the actual unit, you will need to purchase an updated database from Garmin and upload it to this unit. There are a couple of different ways that you can do the database updates. You can do it through an SD card, you can do it through Connext or through a flight stream service. Whichever way you choose, it's just important to make sure your databases are updated before you use it for navigation. We can hit continue and move on to the fuel entry screen. So I'm going to configure this like the Piper Dakota that I'm used to flying, which is 72 gallons of fuel and 14 gallons an hour of fuel burn. However, obviously you should enter this however your airplane is designed. If you have an engine monitoring system, this may not need to be entered and may just automatically populate.
TOS system test OK.
So you will get an audible call out when the TOS system completes its test. And you can see that it starts us in the home screen. Now you can adjust the preset which screen it displays on startup, but you can see that we are at the home screen right now. And let's start by talking about some of the physical controls on this unit. You can see we have the home button right here, which will allow us to access this main menu at any time. So if we're at any other screen, we want to go home, just push the home button. And if you push and hold it, it will take you to the default nav screen. Now this screen is really handy for navigation, and we will talk about it in a little more detail here later, but this is a good shortcut to have. So directly below it, you have the Direct To button, which is used to activate navigation. So if you want to do a simple point-to-point navigation, just type in whatever waypoint you want to go to. So we can do KSGF if we want to go to Springfield. Hit enter and activate, and now we're flying to Springfield. You can also load a segment of a flight plan if you have it queued up here, and then you also can view a list of the top 25 nearest airports to your current location. So if you need to get on the ground quick, you can queue one of those up. Talking about the knobs, we have one on the top left and one on the bottom right hand side of the screen. The top left hand knob is used to adjust your comm volume. So if you want to adjust the volume of ATC independent of the audio panel or your headset volume, you can do that here. Pushing this knob will enable and disable automatic squelch. So if you have a choppy transmission coming in, you can disable automatic squelch to try to see if you can decipher it a little better. However, we do leave that on pretty much all the time. It does act as a good sanity check, where if you want to make sure your audio panel and your headset's working, say you're on flight following and it's been quiet for a while, you can just bump that to hear the static and kind of give you a little bit of peace of mind. You can also push and hold this button to load the emergency frequency in your active frequency area. Instead of having to remember it, just push and hold, and then you can start talking to the controllers, so that's a nice feature. Moving on to the bottom right knob, it has a variety of different functions. You can see that there are different areas on the screen that are going to be highlighted blue based off of what you push. So you can see here, we are modifying the page shortcut option. Here we are modifying our comm frequency. And here we're modifying our nav frequency. When talking about page shortcuts, this is a new feature for the Xi over the old 650, and it can be used to quickly access different screens just by turning the larger diameter portion of the knob. So this is especially handy for turbulence if you need to access a different screen quickly, or if you don't want to go diving through the main menu, you can just dial the knob to the correct page. This is customizable. I'll show you how to do that closer to the end of the video so you can set what order the different pages show up. If you push the knob to highlight your comm standby frequency, that will allow you to modify this frequency using the knob. Turning the larger diameter portion of the knob will adjust the hold number to the left of the decimal point, and turning the small diameter portion of the knob will adjust the number after the decimal point. If you want to make that frequency active, just push and hold the knob to flip-flop it into the active frequency. The exact same functionality applies for nav frequencies, with the large diameter portion adjusting the whole number, small diameter portion adjusting the decimal, push and hold the flip-flop. So we can move on to talk about my preferred way to modify frequencies, which you can access by tapping on the standby frequency. And this allows you to modify the frequencies using the touchscreen. So say we want to go to Springfield Approach at 124.95. We can type in 124.95, hit enter. That frequency is standby. And then when we want to make it active, we can just tap on the active frequency to flip-flop those, or you can push and hold the knob like we discussed earlier. If you enter a frequency that you want to make active right away, just hit the transfer button and it will eliminate the need to put that in standby and make it active. Lastly, you do have access to the monitor button here. So say if you want to get ATIS information, but you don't want to interrupt speaking to approach, you can hit that, press monitor, and then you'll be listening to the ATIS information, but also being able to listen to and talk to approach. So this is a good way to make sure that your primary transmissions aren't interrupted when getting the weather information. And the monitor button isn't limited to just ATIS frequencies. You can use it on all frequencies. The same functionality applies to changing your nav frequencies with the touchscreen, except the only difference is you don't have the monitor button because you don't typically listen to nav frequencies. If you have a transponder integrated in with this unit, you can access that here. And it's as simple as just typing in the code. So if ATC asked us to squawk 0267, we can hit enter. Now you're squawking that code. So the 650XI uses a combination of altitude and airspeed data to change your transponder mode. So we're currently on the ground, so it's on standby. But if you want to modify that, you can access your transponder modes here. So standby will receive information in, but it will not transmit location or altitude data. On will transmit your current location, but not your altitude. And altitude reporting will transmit your current location and your current altitude. If ATC tells you to change to advisory frequency and squawk VFR, instead of manually typing in 1200, you have this VFR hotkey here, so you can just quickly squawk VFR if needed. And then if you need to ident, you can type in your code and hit enter an ident to ident right away, or if you're already going, you can just hit ident. And that's indicated by the ID symbol in the bottom right-hand corner of the transponder box. We can now move on to talking about the map screen, which is where a lot of us will probably spend most of our time. Zooming the map can be done in a couple of different ways. You can pinch and drag like you would on a smartphone or a tablet. However, I find that a little finicky. My preferred way to do it is by pushing the buttons in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, or you can use the smaller diameter portion of the knob to zoom in and out, which is particularly handy for if you're in turbulence. Moving on to the map menu, you can see just how heavily customizable this map is. We'll start by discussing map overlays, and you can see our first selection is the topographical setting. So what that does is it changes the color shading of the ground on the map based off of its altitude. So I live in a pretty flat area, so you can see that it is mostly green. But if we zoom out and go over by the Rocky Mountains, you can see that the color gets much more defined. The next map overlay that you have available to you is the terrain button, which will shade the ground and obstacles different colors based off of your relative altitude and clearance to those obstacles. We will get into the terrain scale here in a little bit when we're talking about its dedicated page. I live in a relatively flat area, like I said earlier, so I leave this turned off because you can only have terrain or NextRad turned on at once, and I prefer to have NextRad. When talking about NextRad, you can turn it on and off through this screen, and these options are going to look different depending on your weather input source. So if you have FISB, you can choose ConUS, regional, or combined coverage, which essentially allows you to view either a low resolution image of weather across the entire United States or a higher resolution image within a closer regional coverage to you. I believe it's 250 nautical miles. There is a combined setting, which gives you the best of both worlds. I typically just leave this on regional because I'm not traveling fast enough typically to worry about weather that's further than 250 nautical miles away. However, if you want that combined, you can utilize it. If you want to enable and disable high or low level airways, you can do that here. However, this does make the map pretty busy, so if you're not going to use them, I would recommend leaving them turned off. If you have a storm scope integrated with this unit, you can turn that overlay on here and also clear your strikes. And if you want to enable or disable traffic overlays on the map, you can do that here. However, I recommend leaving that turned on. We can go to the map setup screen, which allows us to customize some of the information that the map uses. I'm not going to go through all the details. It's heavily customizable based off of user preference, but there are a couple of things that I like to modify. The first thing being I like to turn TFRs on. So if it's not turned on by default, you can do that through the aviation tab. I would turn that on. It shouldn't be your primary source for figuring out where temporary flight restrictions are, but it's never a bad thing to have that overlay on. You can also come to the traffic screen and display what types of traffic are displayed and the range that it's going to overlay on the map. And lastly, you can choose your weather input source here. So if you want to switch to using XM data, you can toggle that here. On the map, you have these 4 fields in each corner of the screen, which are customizable. So you can access those by hitting change user fields. I personally like to leave them in their default configuration, other than I swap distance out for distance and bearing from your destination airport. So say if we want to load up navigating to Springfield, now it shows instead of 21 miles from Springfield, it tells us that we're 21 miles north of Springfield. So that's good just for making your initial call into a non-towered airport. You can also quickly adjust the map detail using this slider here. What I would recommend doing is customizing the map for how you would like it for the most of the time. And then if you happen to get over a busy area, you can just decrease the detail on the map at your convenience. Moving on, we can talk about the traffic screen. And this allows you to view more detailed traffic information about different targets in the area. Zooming the traffic map is done in the exact same way as the main map field. So you can pinch and drag. You can use these buttons, or you can use the small diameter portion in the bottom right knob. If you want to view information about any of the targets, you can just click on it here and it will show you their tail number, aircraft type, closure rate, track, and their ground speed. Also, if you have 2 targets that are close to each other, you can toggle between the 2 by hitting the next button. There are a couple of different settings that you can modify within the traffic menu. The first one being enabling and disabling TCAS. I leave this turned on with one exception, and that is when I'm flying the Fisk arrival into Oshkosh. When I'm doing that, I like to put it on standby because the amount of traffic warnings you get will distract you. So you can change your altitude filter here. So normal will show traffic 2,700 feet above and below you. Above will show traffic 9,900 feet above you and 2,700 feet below you. Below will show traffic 2,700 feet above you and 9,900 feet below. And unrestricted will show you all targets at all altitude. I typically leave this on normal, so it only shows traffic closest to me. However, you can choose some of the other modes if that suits you a little better. You can adjust your motion vectors here. So you can choose an absolute, a relative, or disable the vectors. An absolute vector just shows a vector in the direction that the aircraft is going on the map. A relative vector will also include your airspeed and heading in showing that vector. I typically just leave this on absolute. You can adjust the vector duration here as well. So you can go from 30 seconds up to 5 minutes. I recommend leaving this short because the longer the vector is, the less accurate it is. All it is just making an assumption off of their current airspeed and heading. So a 30-second or 1-minute vector should be all you need. When you hit 5 minutes, they get way far out, and then it's really just not very good, useful information. We can move on from the traffic screen to talk about the terrain screen. So this is where you can view more detailed terrain information than what would be shown on the map overlay. Zooming the terrain screen operates identically to the map and the traffic screen. And we can move in to talk about some of the different options. So talking about the terrain scale, it operates on 2 different scales, whether you are referencing the ground or obstacles. So when it references the ground, anything that is black shows a greater than 1,000 foot clearance. Anything that is yellow is between 1,000 and 100 feet of clearance, and anything that is red, it means you have less than 100 feet of clearance to the ground. Now, obstacles operate on a slightly different scale, and you can change that legend here. So anything that shows up on the map that is white shows that you have between 2,000 and 1,000 feet of clearance. Anything that is yellow is 1,000 and 100 feet of clearance, and anything that is red is less than 100 feet of clearance. On the map menu, you can choose a 360 degree or an arc view. It's just depending on what your personal preference is. You can choose to enable or disable your flight plan overlay. Here you can change your legend, which we showed earlier. And here you can choose to disable the terrain awareness system if you so desire. Moving on from terrain, we can talk about the weather screen. Depending on what weather sources you have will change what options you can click on here. So don't freak out if you only have one or two. If you have a Sirius XM weather package, you can access that weather here. Here you can toggle all sorts of different overlays on the map. You can select a lot of them. However, I recommend only choosing 2 or 3 max because the map does get very busy in a hurry. If you want to view the legend for whatever overlays you have selected, you can do that here. Backing into Frisbee weather, which is where I spend most of my time, you can do the same thing where you can enable and disable the different overlays. And then you have this quick change feature, which will allow you to change between regional, ConUS, or combined NextRad coverage. If you have a Connext weather subscription, you can activate that information here. So you can select your overlays and then adjust your altitude for what the different overlays are displaying. And then if you have an integrated storm scope, you can view the more traditional storm scope style viewer here. So although you can view this overlay the strikes on the map, if you want to view strictly the storm scope, you can activate that. And then you can choose 360 degree or an arc and clear your strikes from here as well. I did just kind of glaze over these features. Keep an eye out for the advanced guide to weather on the GTN 650Xi, where I will go into each of these in a little more detail, showing you what each layer looks like. Moving on from weather, we can talk about the default nav screen. Now, we showed this earlier when showing the hotkey from holding the home button to access this screen at any time. And I'll be honest, I really like this screen. I probably spend more time in this screen than I do on the map if I'm doing some hand flying. So you have access to these 6 fields up here, which are customizable, but by default you have distance, desired track, the distance to and bearing to your destination waypoint, your ground speed, your track, and your ETE. Now, I really like this for hand flying because if you're hand flying, you just want your desired track and your track to equal the same number. So if I'm not using an autopilot, I just use those 2 numbers in combination with reference to this navigator down here, and I can navigate pretty simply without having the map overlay. You also have this flight plan timeline down here. So if you have a flight plan sequenced, it will show you your previous waypoint, current waypoint, and the next waypoint. So that just kind of allows you to know what's coming up next on your flight plans, but it's specifically for if you're flying an instrument approach and you need to know the sequencing. You can toggle between navigating on GPS data or nav frequency data here. So if you're using the GPS for navigation, you want this to show GPS. However, if you're going to tune into an ILS or a VOR, you want this to say VLOC, and then you'll be navigating off of your active nav frequency. You can select your OBS course here. However, I typically make this adjustment on my PFD instead of doing it through the GPS. In the default nav menu, you can configure the user fields here, and you can select them in the exact same way that you would on the user fields in the main map screen. And you also have a shortcut key to the main map screen here, so if you need to toggle to the map quickly, you can do that. Moving on from default nav, we can talk about the flight plan. This is kind of the heart and soul of this unit, so let's walk through kind of basic flight plan configuration. You want to start with your starting waypoint, so we'll just put Bolivar in because we are at Bolivar. And let's say we want to go to Jefferson City, so I can put KJeff in there. So we can load that. We have this nice magenta line here showing that we are navigating from Bolivar to Jefferson City. And if we want to preview that, we can hit preview here and see that we have this nice magenta line connecting the 2 airports. If you want to add another waypoint, you can do that here. And if you want to add, say, a waypoint in the middle, you can insert before or after that waypoint. In the menu, you have several options of what you can do with this flight plan. So you can hit store to put this in the catalog. And then at any moment, if you want to view that catalog, you can view that here and load and activate or invert and activate that flight plan from here. Here you can select to fly a parallel track. So if you want to fly, say, 3 nautical miles to the right of this flight plan, you can do that here. You can also invert this flight plan. So say you flew it, it's complete, you're at Jeff City, you want to fly back to Bolivar, just hit invert and it'll flip-flop everything. You can access temperature compensation settings here. So if you need to shoot a temp compensated approach, you can add the temperature at the destination. And then here you can select the data fields that populate when creating a flight plan. However, I typically just leave these in their default configuration. Now the VNAV setting is awesome, but we need to configure our flight plan to fly a VNAV first. So typically when I fly a VNAV, I like to insert in a long track waypoint of -3 nautical miles. So you can see now we have Bolivar to KJF -3, which is this waypoint that's 3 miles from the airport, and then it will navigate us to Jefferson City. Now when flying a VNAV, you do have to give it an altitude input. So let's figure out what our pattern altitude is by clicking on Jefferson City, going to Waypoint Info, going to Information, and you can see that their elevation is 549 feet. So with that information, I can go back and say I want to fly a 1,600 foot pattern altitude. And we can hit enter to load that altitude constraint and hit save to save it in the flight plan. Now all we need to do is start navigating to that airport. So now that we are en route and flying to Jefferson City, we can go ahead and configure our VNAV. So we can come to the menu, hit VNAV, and then when you want to enable it, just hit VNAV enabled. Now it's going to default to a 3-degree flight path angle. However, I typically descend as a function of airspeed. So we can come in here and put 500 foot per minute vertical descent rate, which is a nice cruising descent. And you can see that our time to top of descent changes to 31 minutes. So now we can go back to the map and view our TOD waypoint here. So at this point, this is when we would need to start our descent. And then you have this KJF -3 waypoint here with a 1,600 foot altitude constraint showing that we would be at that 1,600 foot threshold by the time we reach that point. Now the cool part is if you have an integrated GFC 500 or 600 autopilot, when you reach this TOD waypoint, just push VNAV and it will automatically descend you at your calibrated rate and then automatically level off at your pre-selected altitude. Now I'm not going to ride this all the way through, but if you want to see the entire VNAV process in action for the GTN 650, click the video up here and it will walk you through step by step how to do it and show you what it looks like. Moving on from flight planning, we can talk about procedures. This is where you can load departure and arrival plates if you're flying into a class Bravo, or you can load and activate any approaches that you want. So you can select your airport here and then select your approach, choose your transition, and then you can either load and activate that approach if you so desire. Moving on from procedures, we can talk about the nearest function, which will show you a prioritized list of different waypoints depending on your proximity to them. So say, for example, if we want to view the nearest airports to us, we can click here. First and foremost, if we have any airports within gliding range, you can view that airport here. But it does show the top 25 closest airports to you within a 25 nautical mile range. It'll show how far you are to it and the bearing from that airport to you. And then it also shows their most precise approach with their longest runway. So you can see the closest airport to us is Buffalo Municipal, but they're VFR only and they have a 3,200 foot runway. But if we scroll down to Lebanon, for example, you can see that they have an RNAV approach and a 5,000 foot runway. You can configure these fields so that way, say, seaplane bases don't show up on this map, and I'll show you how to do that closer to the end of the video. You can view this nearest information for a variety of different waypoints. However, I typically use this for airports, center frequencies, and weather frequencies. So if you need to get the nearest AWOS or ASOS weather information, you can access that here. And if you want to load that frequency, you can just tap it and choose if you want it to go in the active or the standby slot. Scrolling over to the next page, we will be able to view the Waypoint Information screen. So this is how you can view more detailed data about a specific airport. It's going to default to either the airport that you're at or the one that you are navigating to. But if you want to select a different one, you can type in its identifier here. Here you can view all sorts of information about an airport. So you should recognize this screen from our VNAV preparation earlier, but you can view the elevation, what fuel they have, time zones, stuff like that. If you want to preview or load any of their procedures, you can do that here. If you want to look at information about the runways, you can click here and do that, and then you can select the individual runway. It tells you information about it, what the lighting situation looks like. So you can see there's pilot controlled lighting on 125.6, and it just shows you a brief overlay of what the runways look like. You can view all the frequencies associated with that airport, and keep in mind you can also click on the frequencies and move them to active or standby. You can preview the entire airport, which does look similar to the runway preview, but this shows some taxiway information, some airspace information. If you're connected to a good weather source, it will show you the current METAR for that airport, so you can view the simplified one or the raw text down here. And if there are any NOTAMs for the airfield, you can view those. So the Waypoint Information screen shows a lot of detailed information for a variety of different waypoints. You can also view and create user waypoints from here. I'm not going to go into details on how to create a user waypoint. If you would like to know more information about that, view the video up top here where we walk through step by step how to create a user waypoint. Clicking on services shows you access to a lot of the satellite-based services here. So if you have a sat phone connection through this unit, you can dial the number here. If you want to text people, you can do that here. If you have a Sirius XM music subscription on this unit, you can dial the station and adjust the volume from this screen. You can send GPS-based position reports from here. However, we probably don't do that very much anymore because now FlightAware and Flight Radar 24 use FISB data instead of GPS-based data. That's really nice because I think they charged you for this and you had to have the subscription, whereas now it just shows all airplanes. And then lastly, you can modify your phone contacts from here as well. Moving on to utilities, you'll see that there are some really good trip planning utilities built into the GTN 650Xi. First and foremost, we have a shortcut to the VNAV screen, which we looked at earlier. And then you have access to the trip planning module. So this is a really handy feature. What you can do is import either your current location or your starting position, import the location that you're going to, or you can import an entire flight plan. And then you can either use sensor data to import your current ground speed or manually select it and then adjust your date and time. When you have all that information selected, hit compute data and it will spit out your distance to, desired track, en route safe altitude, ETE, and ETA numbers for that leg of the flight. So it's a really handy way. Instead of getting your E6B out, you can just plug that information in and the unit will automatically calculate it. The fuel planning screen operates very similarly. So if we want to see how much fuel we would burn from Bolivar to Jeff City, we can select our starting waypoint, select our ending waypoint, or you can do it for a whole flight plan again. And then you'll input your fuel on board, fuel flow, and your ground speed. Now, if you're in flight, you can hit use sensor data to figure out how much fuel you're going to need for the rest of the trip. But if you're on the ground doing trip planning, you can hit compute data and it will tell you that we need 8.5 gallons to get to Jeff. We'll have 51.9 remaining. We'll have 3 hours of reserve fuel, a range of 581 miles, 9.6 miles to the gallon efficiency, and a total endurance of 4 hours and 18 minutes. You can also calculate density, altitude, true airspeed, and winds aloft in this utility. I like to hit use sensor data to import most of the information, and then all you have to do is select your barometric pressure, your outside air temperature, and hit compute data, and it'll spit out your density, altitude, true airspeed, wind direction, wind speed, and then your head or tailwind component. If you are doing a procedure that requires rain, you can predict rain coverage at a specific waypoint at a specific date and time. So you can add the waypoint, the date, the time, and hit compute. and it will let you know if rain is available or not. You also have access to flight timers here, which can be useful for if you're in a hold. You can choose to count up or down and hit start, just have a basic timer. The last utility we will talk about are scheduled messages. So if you want to create a message, you can type the message here and select the type. So event is going to go off once at a specific date and time. A one-time message will go off after a certain elapsed time, and a periodic message will go off at an interval of a set time. So a good example of that would be a reminder to switch tanks every 30 minutes. So here in the system screen, this is mostly used for your avionics installer, but there are a couple of things that I like to have in my back pocket here. First thing is going to be the keyboard orientation. So if you don't like the default setup, you can change that here. And then you can also change your nearest airport runway parameters here. So you can select hard, soft, or water runways only. You can select a minimum length if you have something with a pretty fast wing on it. And then you can choose to include or exclude user airports. Here you can customize your startup page. So if you want it to default to something other than the home screen on startup, you can select that screen here. And then on page 2, you can adjust the page shortcut sequencing. So you can select what pages you want to show up in the desired sequence. You can also customize airspace and arrival alerts here. So the last screen available to us is the emergency screen, which is where you can activate Smart Glide. So you can either push this button, or if we are on the map and we need to activate Smart Glide, you can just push and hold the Direct To button.
Smart Glide active. Airport. 1 o'clock. 3 miles.
So you can see what this does is it's going to automatically recommend an airport to glide to in the event of an engine failure. It shows how far you can glide with this yellow ring. And if you have a coupled GFC 500 or 600 autopilot, it will automatically take over, pitch for best glide, and take you towards that airport so you can focus on running checklists.
Maneuver and land.
When it tells you to maneuver and land, that's when you would disable the autopilot,
miles.
take over the controls, and maneuver and land at that desired airport. From here, you can access the Smart Glide menu and view the runway information about that airport, as well as how high you will be above the ground when you arrive at the airport, and you can squawk 7700 from here as well. So you can see from this brief demonstration that Smart Glide is an amazing piece of aviation technology. It's going to save a lot of lives, and it is an awesome addition that the creators at Garmin have added into this unit. Although this was just a brief demonstration, you can learn more about the Smart Glide feature by viewing my full tutorial on the safety features of the Garmin GTN 650, where we go into this in much more detail. That wraps up this complete tutorial for how to use the Garmin GTN 650 Xi. I thank you guys for watching. Please fly safe, and we will see you in the next video.